Hello. So this one is about poverty measurement, and it's going to be slightly technical, but at the end we're also going to do stuff on how you can use the different measures of poverty. We know enough now about how development policy works that we know that measurements are incredibly important in how to understand what is happening, how to understand which measures of development we can use for policy making, how we know where poverty is, who is poor, who isn't poor. And for that purpose we need poverty measurements. And we'll start with how we measure standards of living in general. So you guys know about this by now. GDP per capita isn't necessarily the best measure for standards of living. So you know that there's gross domestic product per capita, which is per person. You know that we can look at GDP growth, so how much has GDP changed from the previous year, which usually indicates something about the conditions in that year. So maybe there was a recession, in which case it might be really low growth, or it's gone down. Maybe there was a boom, in which case GDP growth would be quite high. As long as GDP growth is positive, GDP is going to be heading upward, and usually in most years, in most places, GDP is increasing to some degree. But of course, we get quite concerned when that growth is low. And GDP was very dominant, and still is very dominant in many ways, for measuring growth. But it's not very good for measuring poverty. And it's certainly not meant for the role that it sometimes has now. So when GDP was created, and this is in the 50s, the dream for GDP was that there should be one indicator that would tell us what is going on in the economy, that everybody could measure and everybody could use the same thing. And there's a quotation which is quite telling, which is that GDP should be, and I quote, "a window into an economy's soul, a statistic to end all statistics." Now, now in the age of big data, that sounds a little bit strange, because why would you only want one statistic? Why wouldn't you want to have as many different kinds of statistics as you would as you could possibly have? And now we're going to talk about multidimensional poverty in a while, which does include an almost infinite number of things that you could measure. But GDP has a very particular meaning. It is an indicator of the amount of economic activity in a country in a given year or in a given time period. And it most certainly was not meant to capture how many people are poor or how many people are well off or how well off those people are. It is meant to be a national indicator of well-being. So in this lecture we're going to focus on individual or community level indicators of well-being. And so these are based very largely on Amartya Sen's capabilities approach. That is underlying most of what we're doing here. The idea that poverty is not just about income, and it is not just about how much money you're making. It's not just about how much your life costs, but it's also about the opportunities that you have. But of course, the opportunities, when we try to measure them, we do often end up measuring quite tangible things. So tangible things could be something like household income. It could be household consumption. Often those are quite similar. Of course, you have as much money, you consume as much money as is coming in, unless you're also borrowing, in which case your consumption could be higher than your income. Or you could take an entirely different approach and look at food energy intake. So that would mean counting the number of calories that you're likely to be consuming and reporting that as your level of well-being. So somebody whose food intake is close to the about 2,000 calories that people need to be able to be healthy, then the less likely you are to be in poverty. And if you are consuming much less than what is required for maintaining a body in motion, which is probably about 1,000 calories, then you're regarded as being in poverty. So the food energy intake approach is trying to measure scientifically how many calories people are taking and what level of calories keeps you healthy. And so taking all these different aspects of people's lives into account. So previously we've mentioned things like housing conditions. We've mentioned things like access to education or access to health services. We've mentioned all kinds of basic services that people might need to be able to have good lives. So those are the things that are measured by multidimensional poverty indices. And we're going to talk a little bit first about multidimensional poverty, because that's a really interesting thing going on right now, and that's very much being improved and developed in different countries at the same time. So many countries are trying to come up with quite creative approaches and country-specific approaches to what they think multidimensional poverty looks like. But what all these approaches have in common is, as the word multidimensional suggests, is that they are able to capture different aspects of people's lives. Now, when you talk about poverty to people who are in poverty or might be in poverty, and when you ask them what does it mean to you to be in poverty, they won't just say I don't have enough money. They will say things like, well, my house is a bit, is not very well built, or I'm not really sure what's going to happen next week or next month or next year. I'm not really sure if I'm going to be able to afford to keep my kids in school, and things like that. So multidimensional poverty tries to capture the things that people report are important to them, or sometimes things that countries have announced in some formal way are important to them. So in some cases, for example, you might get a country's constitution, which indicates that a particular issue is extremely important. So, and that could be, of course, anything. Different countries have very, very different kinds of documents on that, and also different kinds of measurements of standard of living might include absolute or relative measures. So, absolute measures are what we're mostly going to be talking about today, partly because those are the most common ways of measuring poverty in very, very poor places, and partly because relative poverty, really you're getting into quite difficult territory about distinguishing the poor from the non-poor. But the really key issue with relative poverty is social inclusion costs. So if you think about social inclusion costs in the UK, you might think, what does it take to be a real member of society, a full member of society? Well, in this country, you probably need internet access. If you cannot afford internet access, if you have if you haven't got, a library or anything like that you can go to have access to the internet, then it is probably quite difficult to be an informed member of society. If you do not have access to newspapers, if you do not have access to some form of perhaps a hobby, if you do not have access to a job, you would be missing out on key aspects of what it means to be a member of society in this country. And so relative poverty becomes relevant in a situation where social inclusion costs become higher. And of course, as a society gets more complicated, as you move from perhaps a simple rural society and agricultural society into a more complex industrial society, then the costs of social inclusion would be getting higher. And that's where you start to get inequality. So you don't have inequality where you've got, in a society where everyone is very poor, you do not have inequality, right? Because in that group of people, everyone is at the same level, even though that level is very low. But with relative poverty, which you tend to start getting when you go into dense urban environments, and in urban environments where not everyone can become a high productivity member of society who has a high wage, then you start to get relative poverty, which you could say relative poverty is quite close to being the same thing as inequality in a sense. It's just measured using slightly different terminology. But for relative poverty, basically to measure poverty meaningfully, you do need to think about both basic needs and the costs of social inclusion. So it's not enough to say, oh, everyone's poor, so they must all be happy, there's no poverty. Of course, you also need to think about basic needs. Now, the first kind of indicator that I want to bring up is the multidimensional poverty indicator, and this is trying to get at a more complex picture of what poverty might mean, and trying to enable countries to measure poverty in ways that don't just have to do with the economic indicator. So of course GDP growth will often correlate, GDP, very important distinction, GDP per capita will often correlate. GDP per capita will often correlate with most of these indicators to some extent. But we need to forget GDP per capita now, because that is usually a national level indicator. It is possible to get GDP for state level or even sometimes for municipal level in some countries, but that's very, very unreliable data. So usually it's national. And so in a multidimensional poverty indicator, what we're looking at is the usual issues that we think are equal to development, right? So definitions of development. What do you think when you say a more developed country? What do you think about? You think about nutrition. Is there enough food? Child mortality, schooling. Is schooling available? Are there enough years of schooling available? Are the kids able to go to school? Are there teachers to teach them? And then living standards in terms of what you have at home. So things like electricity, sanitation, availability of clean water, floor. That's an interesting one. So this is usually the question is, what material is your house made of, and whether you have an earth floor or not. And if you have an earth floor, that usually means that you've got a little bit more of a problem with sanitation, as in a little bit more of a problem with hygiene often. So on an earth floor, you tend to pick up a few more illnesses and epidemics spread faster and things like that than you normally would if you had a floor made of wood or plastic or any other material that you can make floors out of. So usually having some form of flooring is generally beneficial. It generally means you've got a slightly higher standard of living. Do you have cooking fuel? Does the cooking fuel, any harmful chemicals from the cooking fuel, do they leave your house, or will you end up inhaling them and therefore getting ill because of the cooking fuel? And do you have other assets? Perhaps you've got a bicycle, perhaps you've got machinery, perhaps you've got a car. And those things, being able to accumulate those things to make your life easier would improve your standard of living. And so this is a very kind of crude way of listing things, but you can see how it's much improved from just having GDP. And if you're aware of the Human Development Index, which is by now kind of considered as outdated, but you can see this is to some extent based on that, because we've got something about health and we've got something about education in the multidimensional poverty indicator. So it's kind of taking that idea and just taking that very much further and making it very much more nuanced and detailed. But the weighting of these different indicators is done very differently in different countries. Now, when we were first developing the multidimensional poverty indicators, this was being done at the time in about 2010 at the University of Oxford, which is still working on this, as you'll see in a second. But it's the one of the big arguments in the indicator, in a sense, between different academics when they were developing this was, well, there were two really big discussions. One, do we need one single indicator? Do you want to squeeze all of this stuff into one number? Does it make sense? Because then you might run into problems where you've got your multidimensional poverty indicator. Okay, you might have the information that this is, 0.75 in a given country. Doesn't matter on what scale, just that the indicator gives you a value of 0.75. And then let's say your child mortality is reduced, and now your multidimensional poverty indicator goes down, so now it goes down to 0.73. And then your school attendance, so your children are no longer dying, but for some reason they're also not attending school, so school attendance goes down, so then it goes back to 0.75. You wouldn't see from that one number. So it went down and then it went back up again. You wouldn't be able to see the difference. So you wouldn't know that perhaps mortality went down, but school attendance also went down. So actually, are we better off? Are we worse off? We don't really know. And the indicator, if you only have one indicator, it hides all of that information. And hiding information is generally not great for policy, because in policy making, you want to know where the problem is. You want to know whether the problem is child mortality or school attendance. Is the problem that they're dying young, or that they're not, or that they're dropping out of school to go to work? You can't really do policy unless you know where the change was. And so it's very much now the favored approach that we should think about having all the information rather than just trying to do the one indicator. So having the one indicator or several indicators was the first big debate. The second big debate was, if we're going to have one indicator, how on earth do we weight these? So we've got these different types of indicators here. So we've got health, and we've got education, and then we've got housing and assets, so living standards. So what would you say would be the relative importance of these things? So would you say, should it be 33 each? 33% each? Would you say they're equally important? Well, we don't know. There's no formula that can tell us that. Should it be, maybe health is the most important thing, so maybe you need that to be, maybe that's not good at 33, maybe you need that to be 50? Perhaps? Then is education more important than a standard of living? It completely depends on the context. And so the next argument that was had was about these weights, and for a few years scholars genuinely tried to attach weights to these things and kind of tried to agree on a set of weights. And of course, that's predictably, that turned out to be a bit of a disaster in the sense that they just couldn't agree on it, basically. And so what we've ended up with now is a scheme whereby countries tend to decide their own weights and tend to decide. So some country, there might be countries out there that really care about something like electricity, really care about sanitation. That's toilets, by the way. Sort of, do you have a way of removing your waste, your human waste? They might really care about availability of water. Maybe it's that there's no wells in the area, but they might not care so much about the cooking fuel, for instance. So maybe cooking fuel is really abundant, so there's a particular country that doesn't really mind whether they've got cooking fuel or not. Whereas a different country or a different setting might have very different preferences for what exactly they need to be aiming at and what kinds of things they're most concerned about. So this diagram is just one sort of generic example. Now, there's a place where you can get more details on different case studies. And it's this beautiful report from 2015, done precisely by the Oxford Institute, that's been creating the multidimensional poverty indicators. And it's called Measuring Multidimensional Poverty, Insights from Around the World. If you Google that title, you should be able to find the PDF. And it's got case studies of all these different countries that are listed here. So hopefully some of your country case studies are on there. And it might be worth just reading one or two of the cases just to get an idea for where these different countries get their priorities from. So, for example, they might be getting them from somewhere like your national constitution might express particular preferences. So in Latin America, the rights of minorities and indigenous people are often in some way enshrined in the constitution, for example, because this was a very fashionable topic around the time that those documents were written. In other countries, the priorities may be very different depending on the history of that country and what they think is relevant. So there might be some particular identified problems. They might have had particular kinds of epidemics. They might have had particular types of historical events that led them to particularly value certain issues as being key deprivations. So deprivations meaning something that you are missing. And so I would very much invite you to have a look at that PDF and pick a country, or perhaps two or three. They're really short reports. The whole report, I think, is about 20 pages long. So it's a fairly straightforward thing to sort of go and have a quick look at how different countries measure multidimensional poverty. Now, multidimensional poverty is different from the kind of poverty that we're going to move on to now. So multidimensional poverty is something that aims to measure all these different types of issues on their own terms. So if education is measured in years, then education can be measured in years. If something like the quality of your housing is measured in terms of the material that you've got, then that is the indicator that you're using. Is there an earth floor? Is there not? What proportion of people in a village, for example, have an earth floor? That might tell you something about the quality of life in that village. So now we're going to move to poverty measurements, which are largely income-based. And this is because most of the empirical work and most of the policy work and most of the stuff you hear about poverty in the news and in sort of policy papers and things like that will be on some form of extreme poverty measurement. So this is by far the most common headline measure of poverty. And you need, for pretty much every measure of measurement of poverty that is income-based, you need to have some form of distinction between the poor and the non-poor. And so for that, you need a poverty line which distinguishes the poor from the non-poor. So the non-poor aren't necessarily rich, that's why we don't call them that, but they are not below the poverty line. And you can see from this slide that we've had quite a big sort of increase in what we think is extreme poverty in the world. So this approach begins in around the early 90s. We start to think, okay, we should have some sort of way of comparing poverty across the board in different countries. We should have some way of comparing countries. And so the initial, the $1 a day that you might have heard about, which is the this 90s measure of it's $1 and comes out to $1.01 a day, and that was quite convenient. That actually comes from a range whereby it was calculated in all of the world. What does it take to have the very, very basics for survival? This is a really low standard of living. You're just surviving. And the top end of that range was $370 per year. And so that then became a newspaper headline type thing of $1.01 a day, and that became $1 a day. And that's the dollar a day that you might have heard of. So that's now nearly 20 years ago. And we don't use the dollar a day anymore. As you can see from these figures, we've had rather a lot of inflation in this in poverty lines. But one thing that's not changed is that we do try to measure it on a per day, per person basis. So remember that if you are, if you're a mother with 3 kids, then you'd actually have to be making, even just to meet the dollar a day, you'd have to be making $4 a day because you've got 3 kids, right? So it is per either per year or per day per person. So in families not everyone earns equally, and so it's not just enough to be making this, you've actually got to be making enough for the whole family. And in 2005 we introduced 2 different ones because we were starting to realize that actually there's so many different kinds of developing countries. So there's some countries where the $1.25 is actually very meaningful, where we can say, okay, this reasonably separates the very poor from the slightly less poor, so it gives us some form of priority. So that's where we would get the $1.25, for example, and then the people under $2 would give us another indication of perhaps. So for example, if you ended up with, perhaps you would end up with only, this is random example here, but maybe if you ended up with 10% of your population under the $1.25, but if you then had 60% of your population under $2, you still know that most of your population is extremely poor. So that 10, of course, being included in that 60 because they're still under $2, right? So those two different poverty lines were meant to give more detail on exactly where the poor fell. And these are really, really low poverty lines. So for us, obviously, this amount of money would get us nothing in the UK, for example. And indeed, in most of the world, so last year, we had, 2 years ago even, we had a change in the poverty lines that went up quite radically. So it's gone up now. Currently, at the time of recording this, it's gone up to $1.90 and $3.10. And those are the 2 poverty lines that we're using at the moment, and we should probably expect in another 5 to 10 years we're going to have some sort of adjustment again, simply because prices around the world tend to be going up. And how these are calculated gets very complicated, because then you have to consider currencies and you have to consider the passage of time and so on. I'm not going to go into that, but it's good to be aware that these do go up, and they are adjusted. And imagine when they're adjusted, what the statisticians have to do, they've got to go back and all the backdated information as well. So all the sort of data from previous years, they've got to convert it into the new, into the most recent version. So when you go into the World Bank website now, what you'll see is they'll give you a long timeline of poverty under $1.90 and under $3.10. They won't, so in order to keep it comparable over time. So that's quite a big job in terms of massaging the statistics, but they do try to make it so that you can actually follow what's happened to the poverty level in a particular country over a particular period of time. But having said previously that these are very low poverty lines, Another thing that you'll see when you look at the very long list of poverty indicators on the data websites, you will see national absolute poverty lines as well. National absolute poverty lines, that means that it's different for every country. So rather than having this standardized number that you're working to, it will be the country's own decision what they think is the appropriate poverty line. And this is where the fun starts, because of course then you will know what you can know what the poverty line is. You can usually find that out. But these poverty lines are the subject of huge discussion, and they can be lower than the global extreme poverty lines. So there have been, for example, different states in India have had different poverty lines. So they might have one national, but then they've also actually got several different ones for different states, some of them being as low as something like 20 or 30 cents a day. So they might actually, so national poverty lines could be set either below or above the global poverty line. So on the other hand, somewhere like Mexico, which is a fairly well organized society, most of the country where life costs a little bit more, it's been estimated that you need something like $8 or $9 a day just to have a decent just to have a sort of basic quality of life. So $1.90, there are very few people in Mexico under $1.90, but at the same time $1.90 really, that is a very, very low standard of living, and so therefore it's not really enough. So different countries do this in very different ways, and they've got very different estimates. And when you look at statistics of poverty, when you look at poverty statistics based on national poverty lines versus global poverty lines, those data sets will look extremely different, because not every country decides on the national poverty line in the same way. But there's an argument to be made about national poverty lines that, well, perhaps it should be the country's own decision what they think constitutes poverty. So then you can think about, well, should it be for some Western organization to say, we think that you need to have $1.90 a day, or should it be up to the country themselves? That's yet another debate that we need to deal with when we're trying to understand how to measure poverty, with it being the subjective thing that it is. And when you get to wealthy countries, such as most countries in the European Union, for example, then you get to most of the poverty lines that are used then are relative poverty lines. So then you get into, for example, the European Union poverty line, which is that you are poor if you are earning below 60% of the median income. So you take the average income. If you are earning just over half of that, that makes you poor. So in this country, that would be something along the lines of between 10 and 15,000 pounds a year gross. That would be poverty according to the EU in this country, because the average salary is somewhere in the 20s. So 60% of that would make you poor, less than 60% of that. So that would be a relative poverty line. It depends on where the median income is. The nice thing about median income as opposed to mean income is that it's not the median is not skewed as much by the super rich. So actually this is a reasonable, so if somebody at the very top gets very much richer, it doesn't affect the median income, which is quite useful. So the median will only move basically if quite a large proportion of the population move up. So that's why it's median rather than a pure mean average income. So when we're setting poverty lines, you need to think about where you want to set them, and that's going to be anchored to the cost of living in the local area. If you're trying to set a global poverty line, you need to think about quite a large data set, because you're looking at a couple of hundred countries. And but usually poverty lines would be at some minimal level of healthy functioning. So we don't do poverty lines at high levels of income. That makes no sense, because we're trying to measure specifically poverty, remember? And as I mentioned earlier, the OECD and the EU, for example, might measure poverty in relative terms, and then we could also call it inequality. So I'm not going to do much more in this particular video about that. And but we need poverty lines in order to have in order to be able to work with most poverty measurements. And remember that this is the whole point of this is to actually create data. So we are trying to understand how to create data sets for empirical work. And so there's always the risk, like there is with any data, of are we measuring what we mean to measure, and are the measures comparable across space between different countries, that is, and are they comparable across time. So you don't want to constantly be changing the indicators, because then you'd constantly be, then you could never compare what's happened over time. So to some extent you need to think about testing the same thing, measuring the same thing every year, and that gives some stickiness to how much we can change these different indicators. But somehow we've got to classify the poor and the non-poor. And the tension between absolute and relative, as we mentioned earlier as well, is that comes out of the cost of social inclusion. So this is, in a sense, the cost of social inclusion is almost a process that's entirely exogenous to what is happening in the world of poverty. So if there's urbanization occurring, for example, and people are moving to the cities, and therefore the cost of social inclusion is going up because you now need to be more educated in order to be able to follow the world, then that is a process that's happening everywhere, probably not just in the particular communities where you're trying to measure poverty. So it's a bit of a tension between efforts and processes here, and we need to draw the line somewhere. So you remember in the documentary that we watched with the Cambodian family where the wife was having twins, and they had this poor card thing. So that's what they're doing. They're setting a difference between who they think is poor and who they think is non-poor. And for this family, it was caused a bit of anxiety whether they were able to actually qualify as poor and therefore get the poor card and all the benefits that went with it. But unfortunately that is the nature of these statistics, is that you've got to draw the line. One interesting question about measuring about asking whether we are measuring what we intend to measure. So as an example, the food intake measure. So if you're taking how much does it cost to get 2,000 calories, if that's your measure. Well, the thing is that not all calories are created equal. So calories that are in rice or in wheat are usually a lot cheaper than calories, for example, in red meat. And so actually, depending on diets and depending on what types of preferences people have for food, you may find that you do get these sort of discontinuities, that, for example, a richer country might be spending more money per calorie because their calories are from foods that are perhaps nicer to eat or have a little bit more variety than perhaps a poor person's diet, which might just be a lot of rice and maybe a little bit of vegetables. So you might end up with a situation where the richer country that spends more per calorie ends up being the poorer country because fewer people can actually afford the amount of calories that you want. So you have to make sure when you're putting these exercises together that you don't inadvertently cause those kinds of wrinkles in your measurement. And of course, this is where multidimensional indicators are also quite useful, is that you when you aggregate lots of them, you then any wrinkles in any individual one of them will become less and less important. But generally, the point of standard of living data is to compare either the same location across time or different locations at the same time, or perhaps different locations across time as well. And we normally want to do this in order to... social science often looks at before and after situations. So you might say, okay, there was a policy change, perhaps there was a new law, perhaps there was some kind of change in how they measured things or how they allocated resources, or there was a new definition of who's poor or something like that. Maybe a new hospital was built and they want to test the impact of that on the local community or the usage of services or something like that. So usually we want to use past events and the before and after data on those in order to inform future policy making, because, as you know, to be able to evaluate the effect of different policy changes is really important. You wouldn't want to make policy where you have no idea what the impact of it is going to be. If you have aid, for For example, foreign aid now is very much based on, can you prove that this had some kind of impact? And so you need data for this. And so having a large number of indicators does enable you to identify different kinds of trends. So perhaps there's been an aid project that had a great impact on the access of children to schooling, but not such a great impact on the quality of housing. Well, that's okay, because perhaps it was aimed at improving the quality of schooling and it didn't do anything to try to get to housing. And so it would be misleading to just say, well, this didn't make much of a dent in some big national high-level indicator. So it's really important to understand that there's not this attempt to find an indicator that is somehow the best. That's not what we're doing here. We're just looking for different kinds of information, because in different countries, in different circumstances, at different times, different things will be interesting to researchers. And so you want to collect this data to have the maximum possible number of data points that you can then use for future studies. So we are really trying to find out lots of information about how people are experiencing it. Now, there's one thing to be slightly careful of, and especially when we talk about GDP growth. So we've got GDP growth, which means the amount of change that there has been in your GDP figure from the previous year. And economic growth is very, very different as an indicator from the level of GDP per capita. So how much growth there was is independent of what the level is. Okay, so the growth is just how quickly the level changes. And the problem that we find with a lot of studies that try to look at economic growth, so really economic growth is how quickly did your economy grow this year. And we often use it for signaling of, we often think, oh, if there's high economic growth, then there's probably lots of other good things going on. There might be lots of investment coming into the country, or there might be lots of business activity going on in the country, new business activity. There might be lots of new jobs. There might be lots of new skills generated. So when an economy is, in newspapers, for example, we often say an economy is healthy when it's got high levels of growth. And so we often think that's a really good thing, quote unquote good thing. And the thing is that economic growth is not a great indicator to use in a development kind of sense, certainly not if you're trying to figure out what causes economic growth. So whether well-being in fact causes economic growth, or whether economic growth in fact causes well-being. It's much better to look at something that has two variables that both change quite slowly, because economic growth, the problem with economic growth is that it goes up and down all the time. Okay, so I'm going to go on to the next slide and talk about the trend stationary and stochastic series. And this isn't something that's hugely important for this course, but especially if you're doing econometrics next year, this is going to come back, and you're going to work with it and trying to figure out how to deal with the fact that you've got such different variables that you're being asked to correlate. So here we've got, for Ethiopia, we've got GDP growth here. Percent of GDP, total GDP growth. So this is all data from the World Bank through the Google app, and so this GDP growth, that is something that tells you how hot the Ethiopian economy was in any given year. And we can see that there's some years when it's been very hot, like 1993. 1987, stuff was happening there. So 13% economic growth. That's massive. That's huge economic growth. Some really big boom happened there. Usually big booms, as we can see, were preceded by big busts. So minus 11%. That's a huge drop. That's some big disaster. And actually that's a famine. And again, there's been some big disaster here in the early 90s. These are really, really big problems. In a normal country, you would see, in most countries, certainly wealthy countries, you would see economic growth moving more or less in that region. So maybe a really bad recession would be -2. Really, really amazing economic growth might be about 5. And that would be, so for the UK, even about 3 at the moment would be quite good. Okay, so you can see that Ethiopia here has huge variability, certainly through the 80s and 90s. And at the same time, then we've got here fertility over the same period. So if we look at this graph and think of it as an indicator of development, well, we can see that we've gone from about 7 kids per woman to just above 4 kids per woman. And most development scholars would say, yes, that is an improvement. I mean, 4 kids per woman is still a lot, but it's almost halved from what it was in 1982, which is where this chart comes from. So you can see here, it's I've set the period as being from 1982 out to the end of the series, and then here you can see what the actual years are. So so it enables you to adjust the axis. This is again the Google Public Data app, but it's using World Bank data, and so we've got this. What we can definitely say is development in some way. We've got fewer kids. Perhaps that's being accompanied by more of those kids going to school and so on. But there's no way that if you did so this would be what we call a trend stationary variable, the fertility. So trend stationary meaning that it's more or less going in the same direction all the time. So it's more or less heading downward. And it's pretty predictable what it's going to be next year. But if you were to say that that's somehow correlated with growth here, then you'd have to say that if next year they have an absolute disaster and there's a horrible financial crisis like here or here, and there's a contraction in the economy, does that automatically lead to an increase in fertility? Well, of course not. Just because they have a recession, they're not going to suddenly start having more kids, are they? That wouldn't make sense, especially because next year this could go right back up again and they might have a boom. And as you can see, actually, even in Ethiopia, even though it's a complicated place, but actually you can see for the last 10 years they've actually had very high economic growth. In fact, it's fairly healthy, and they haven't had any of these disasters that they had previously, like here and here and here and here. So, but you can see how if you tried to correlate, if you tried to find some way in which these two graphs move together, you couldn't. You couldn't say when this goes up, that goes up, when this goes down, that goes down. You can't see that, and the problem with there is that fertility is something that doesn't go up and down with the economic cycle, the economic business cycle. And so GDP growth, what the moral of the story here is, first of all, to not confuse growth with level, as in growth being what we've got here, GDP growth. This is not the same thing as GDP per capita. Okay, GDP per capita is something very, very different. That would be a level. And the fertility is definitely a level. So that's how many children. It's a number of children. It's not an increase in the number of children. So we've had, well, if it's halved, if it's gone from, let's say it had gone from 8 to 4 kids, that would be a drop of 50% in kids. But that's not what we're measuring here. We're measuring the number. The fertility rate is the actual number of kids. You can get that information, by the way, by clicking on that question mark. So that question mark will tell you then exactly what the indicator is measuring. And in this case, it's average births per woman. That's what it gives you. So so economic growth, really the simplest moral of the story is forget about economic growth as an indicator. It does not correlate. The reason it doesn't correlate with well-being is because economic growth goes up and down in ways that are not reciprocated by social development indicators such as fertility, for example. Now, there's so many different measurements of poverty, and you should not feel in any way obliged to use them all. This lecture is going to be trying to get you to understand more or less what all of these are, and you'll see when you start to read them through that actually they're formed of just a few different kinds of components. So first of all, I'm going to kind of exclude the ones that are about relative poverty. So that's all the income share ones. So these are all looking at what income share is held by, let's say, the highest 10%. So if, for example, 90% of the income share is held by the highest, the richest 10%, that's a very unequal society. But that's more going into inequality, so I'm not going to go into that. So we'll leave that out for now. The rest of the bits here have to do with either they are poverty gaps, which I'll explain in a second, or they're poverty headcounts, which I'll also explain in a second. Here we're seeing poverty gap at $1.90, $3.10, and the national poverty line. So they give you all those different options. These are the World Bank's indicators that are all publicly available, by the way. So the poverty gap and the poverty headcount, I'll go into in a second what those are. Then you've got rural poverty gap, rural headcount, so same thing. You've got urban poverty gap and urban poverty headcount, again combining the same elements that we've already mentioned. And then you've got things that have to do with surveys. So a survey is, as it says here, consumption or income per capita. So a survey means that you talk to some proportion of the population and you figure out what the average survey would be. And that's why it says mean consumption or income per capita. And that's what the rest of them are. So survey consumption. So this is when people report to you how much money they make or how much money they spend. And now these are all subject to people's own reports of how much money they make and how much money they spend. That's one reason, by the way, why we do this per day. Because most people, certainly in very poor countries where they might be working in agriculture, they might be working in the informal economy, they won't be able to tell you what they make per year because they don't get tax certificates or something like that. And because the paperwork is so much poorer, that it's much easier to say how much do you make per day, and then it's a more accurate estimate. Whereas if you said per year, then that's a bit, you're creating a lot of error there. But you can see, even though there's a lot of these indicators, actually a lot of them are formed of some really basic common elements. So to go back over the previous one, so you've got poverty headcount, poverty gap, and the poverty gap squared, which is a slightly different version, which I'll go into in a second. You might have household income or consumption, and then you've got, in addition to all of that, you've got multidimensional poverty indices. The World Bank isn't offering you multidimensional poverty indices in that list of indices, so those are usually calculated separately, and they're not normally World Bank data, partly because they're based in each country on such different data. And one of the big questions of what remains of this lecture is to think about what the limitations of each of these indicators are. What information can you get when you've got the data for these indicators or you haven't? And you will notice that all three of these ones require knowledge of a particular poverty line. So in order to calculate a head count or a gap, you need a particular poverty line. Now, the very simple way of thinking of a head count, it's really, really straightforward. It's simply the proportion of people who are below the poverty line. That's it. So you take the whole population and you figure out how many people are poor, and then you come up with a percentage. Now notice, even though it's called head count, you still come up with a percentage. Okay, so a head count might be expressed as, you might come out with 0.35. That would be 35% of people in poverty, or it might be expressed as 35 out of 100. And so a poverty head count is just the proportion of people in poverty. It's as simple as that. And so that's very, very easy to understand. The poverty gap is a little bit more complicated, but I'm going to spend some time on understanding the poverty gap because it is a much better indicator in a lot of ways for understanding the real depth of poverty. Now don't panic. So here's the poverty gap calculation. And it's not as bad as it looks, I promise, and I'll try and make it as clear as possible. So, the poverty gap so that's the P1 is the overall, the statistic that you'll have if you look at the World Bank database on poverty gap data. That's what it'll give you. And so what this is doing is it's saying, okay, we've got several individuals, 1, 2, let's say we've got 1, 2, and 3. And we have the poverty line, which is at a given level of income, and that's zero income. And then you've got different, so notice that this poverty line could be any, so it could be $1.90, it could be $1, it could be $2, $3, whatever, it doesn't matter. That is the poverty line. This works with this idea works with any poverty line at all. Now, what we're trying to figure out is the poverty gap GN, which is the difference between the poverty line and income. So it's that. The difference between the poverty line and income. So let's say individual 1, for example, and that is their income. That's how much money they're making. So this is, and so the poverty gap for that individual is the distance between their income and the poverty line. So that's the gap. And then we've got individual number 2, who perhaps has a smaller poverty gap. And they've got shorter distance, so that's a smaller poverty gap. And then we've got individual 3, who let's say is quite a lot better off, and so they're quite far away from the poverty gap. So the reason we've got this monster here is all that that's saying is that if your income is greater than your poverty line, then only in that case will you count. So the IK, so that if the bracketed expression K is true, if your income is less than the poverty gap, so that's your income, that's your poverty gap. If your income is less than the poverty gap as it is, than the poverty line as it is here, then you'll count. If your income is more than the poverty line, like it is for this guy, then you do not count for the calculation of the GN. Okay, so you take the GN, you take the each of these, you calculate what the length of that gap is for each individual separately. That's your GN. You calculate that as a proportion of the poverty line, which is your Z. Z is, poverty line is Z. And so you take that distance as a proportion of that whole distance, and that gives you that expression. You then add all of those together from individual 1 to individual n. N in this case we've got 3 individuals, so n is 3. And you add those up. This is a summation sign, this squiggle here. So you add up all of those, you get a percentage here, right? So that guy looks to probably be about halfway between 0 and the poverty line, so his poverty gap is probably about 0.5, about half of the poverty line. This one, maybe it's a quarter, maybe it's about 0.25. You add those together, so you get 0.5 plus 0.25. And that's the summation. So all that the summation is doing is it's adding each one of them together. So rather than having to write them all out here, and there could be thousands, this is just a notation that's just making it slightly simpler to say it's from individual 1 to individual n. That's what that means. So you're adding them all together, and then you're taking the average. And that's why you've got the 1 over n. So of course average is, it's just, you all know how an average is calculated. It's the sum of all the different ones. And remember that this guy, because he's above there, he doesn't count. The reason he doesn't count, by the way, is because obviously you don't want this guy cancelling out the effect of this first guy. Okay? So you don't want to say, oh, just because someone's above the poverty line means that someone else below the poverty line doesn't count. You don't want them cancelling each other out. And that's why we don't count guy number 3. So we add them all together, take the average, and that is your poverty. That gives you your poverty gap. So it's the average distance from the poverty line for those who are poor, and it's the average in the entire population. So it is the average distance from the poverty line. If you only remember the poverty gap as being the average distance from the poverty line, that's all you need. And the meaning of that is that rather than just remember the head count, the idea of the head count was that that you were only looking at, okay, for the head count for these these 3 guys. So we've got number 1 who's below, number 1 here who's below the poverty line, number 2 here who's below the poverty line, number 3 who's above the poverty line. So your head count is 2/3, 2 out of 3, or 66%. Yeah? or 67%, 66.6%. That would be your head count. But the poverty gap would calculate also how far these guys are. So how far these guys are, these number 1 and number 2, how far they are from the poverty line, and not just whether they are above the poverty line or not. So it gives, the poverty gap gives us more information about just how poor they are. If you're poor, how poor are you? Because it's not quite the same thing to have almost nothing as it is to be almost close to the poverty line. So that's a calculation of the poverty gap. And so the poverty gap gives you the intensity of poverty as well as the incidence of poverty. So whereas the head count gives you only the incidence. So head counts, just to repeat that, head counts give you the incidence of poverty. Poverty gaps give you the intensity of poverty. Okay? And so as we've got in this little diagram here, so we can see that if you are working with head counts, then if you start off here and then you move up, nothing changes in the head count because you haven't crossed the poverty line. The change only happens once you cross the poverty line, and then you start, then that makes a difference in the indicator. Whereas here, with the poverty gap, any change makes a difference. So you improve the poverty line, you improve the poverty gap even if you're moving below the poverty line, like this guy is. And similarly, this guy is improving the poverty gap by moving up. And when this guy moves up, though, so he might move up, he's hitting the poverty gap, and then getting to a higher level, and now no longer classified as poor because the poverty line is here. But that remaining bit of the distance, that's not going to count anymore. So it only counts in the poverty gap, remember, for as long as he's below the poverty line. Now, the reason we've got a squared poverty gap, and this is something that if you're really interested you can work out for yourself, but what we're doing instead with the squared poverty gap is we're then taking that, we're putting another mathematical operation into the equation. And the reason we want to do that is because, of course, if we've got, imagine that you've got someone down here and they move up to here. That is an improvement. We know that's an improvement because it was an improvement here as well. So every improvement is an improvement in the poverty gap. However, you might think in human terms. You might think, well, this is a much, much more important change than this would be, because here you're perhaps improving someone's life whose life is already maybe okay, whereas here it's someone who was initially very, very desperate, and then they're improving. So you might want to say, well, I want to make sure that the indicator that I'm using weights that more highly. And that's exactly what the squared poverty gap does. So you can see that if your poverty gap is 0.1 versus if your poverty gap is 0.3, so when you square them and only then look at the improvement, then you can see that the further down you were when you square these two, you get a bigger distance than you would higher up. And when you get closer and closer to the poverty line, you start to get an even smaller squared poverty gap. And that means that we end up weighting this improvement more highly. See, that's a better change than that is. And so we end up basically inadvertently biasing the system toward these guys. And that would be a very pro-poor kind of approach, is where we want to specifically advantage the very, very poor. And so changes of the same size in an individual person's conditions will produce larger changes in the poverty gap squared if their starting point was lower, even if the change in their own circumstances is the absolute magnitude of the change is identical. But you get more poverty gap improvement out of helping the very, very poor. And you might be wondering, why do we need all these indicators? Why is it relevant that we have so many different complicated kinds of indicators? Well, it matters because policymakers are making decisions based on these indicators. And these indicators affect what the policymakers do. By the way, before we move on, of course, we've got the multidimensional as well. it's not as straightforward as the other three, because here it's comprised of lots of different bits, and there can be improvements in any individual one of these, and it'll cause a small improvement. If you're doing an overall multidimensional poverty index, it'll cause a small, so you can have quite a big increase in one little indicator. It'll cause a small improvement in the overall index, but the multidimensional is kind of pointless to represent on here, because in reality it reflects the weight of the improvement. We talked about the weights earlier. But it's quite clear which, out of the head counts, the poverty gap and the squared poverty gap, it's quite clear how they incentivize policymakers. And here's the really big deal, is that if you are trying to help, if you are using the head count, so remember, when you're using the head count, you're trying to move people across the poverty line. Well, if you're a policymaker and you're smart and you've got a limited amount of money, and you need to improve the head count by the largest possible number of people, then of course you're going to focus on the people who are easiest to help. You're not going to care about these guys because they're already above the poverty line. They don't help your, they're not going to help your measure. And you're not going to care about these guys because they're too difficult to help, or your limited budget might not help that many of them, or you might only be able to bring them up to here but no further, and you do not, if you're using the head count, you don't get the benefit. You as the policymaker, if you're using a head count, you don't get any benefit out of it unless people actually cross the poverty line. So if you are using the poverty head count, then that's a very powerful incentive to help only the people just below the poverty line, which of course intuitively doesn't make sense, because surely we think you should help the poorest of the poor, which is where the poverty gap and the poverty gap squared comes in. So actually the poverty gap squared incentivizes you to help these guys. The poverty gap, perhaps certainly more than the head count, incentivizes you to help the people who are below, and that you can move them up, because now you get credit for each person that moves up. And the multidimensional, of course, can to some extent help all of them, depending on how you're measuring it. If you're measuring it on housing or sanitation or education or something like that, then you can target it however you want. But you can see how just the head count provides a really unfortunate incentive to help the ones that have the most chance of crossing the poverty line. And policymakers are really savvy like this, and this is going back to the point of national poverty lines, is that of course policymakers will set the national poverty lines where they want, and they will do that based on their own preferences and their own political goals, and they do that. So just to summarize, so here we've got a summary table. So if we've got the 4 poverty indicators, and this table is really for you to check your own understanding of whether you understand how the different indicators work. So when we talk about transfers, we're talking about any kind of movement of resources from one household to another. So this could be something like a child helping their parents, it could be a sibling helping another sibling, it could be a taxpayer helping another taxpayer through the tax system. Okay, it doesn't matter, just as long as it's the 2 different households. And so if we look at a non-poor to non-poor transfer, then you can see that it is the only index that picks that up, that notices, because this is all happening above the poverty line. Nothing changes for anybody below the poverty line in a non-poor to non-poor transfer. So, but if, for example, somebody's helping their elderly parents build a better house, or puts sort of a better sanitation system in their house, then you can see how a multidimensional poverty index might pick that up, depending on what the multidimensional poverty index is measuring. However, if you look at the non-poor to poor transfer, so here we're looking at a transfer that goes from above the poverty line to below the poverty line. And so here we're definitely helping somebody who's below the poverty line. But is that picked up by the indices? Well, the head count, remember, only reacts to somebody crossing the poverty line. So the head count is only going to pick this up if the recipient is crossing the poverty line. However, when there's money moving from above the poverty line to below it, then of course you're changing something below the poverty line. And remember that the poverty gap and the gap squared, neither of those are going to react to anything happening above. So the fact that the wealthier person is losing something doesn't matter to the poverty gap. The only thing that matters is that somebody below the poverty line has moved up. So that is going to affect the poverty gap. And finally, if we look at the poor-to-poor transfer, we can see that it will affect, again, it's the same thing with the head count, if it only affects, so let's say that somebody's below the poverty line and somebody else who's also below the poverty line, one of them helps the other, it's only going to affect the head count if the recipient, who is now made better off, if they, in being made better off, were to cross the poverty line. However, in the poverty gap, this is quite an interesting thing, is that if we have a poor-to-poor transfer, which is, we're assuming that it's the wealthier out of those two helping the poorer person. So of course the poverty gap, if the recipient then subsequently ends up crossing the poverty line, so it's if, let's say, a parent helps their child and then the child ends up subsequently just earning enough to, or just having enough money, just having enough income to cross the poverty line, then that would hit the poverty gap, because of course the poverty gap, you're then taking that person out of the equation because they've now gone from being poor to non-poor. But if there's only a movement, if there's a poor-to-poor movement where nobody crosses the poverty line, then of course the poverty gap doesn't change because one person's lost a bit of money and the other's gained it. But as we know from the squared, that will pick up if these people are at different levels. So the poverty gap squared would pick up a poor-to-poor transfer, whereas the poverty gap wouldn't. So this is just really an exercise to understand the different measurements. And of course, with the multidimensional poverty index, it all depends completely on what is being measured here and what type of transfer it is and what it's being used for and so on. So that's a much more complicated story. So that's it for now. Thank you very much.